A mother once locked herself in a room and made a decision. She would not come out until her son was saved. At that very same moment, miles away, something unexpected was already unfolding. Here's a short story of faith. Let's take a moment together to reflect and find a little calm, even on hard days. Long before that day ever came, before her son was even born, his father had quietly prayed a bold and costly prayer. He asked that if God ever gave him a son, that child would one day be sent to China, a distant land, closed off and spiritually untouched. The boy grew up never knowing that prayer had been spoken over his life. He was raised in a Christian home, surrounded by faith, taught the scriptures, and encouraged to trust God. But despite all of that, his heart remained unchanged. He tried more than once to make himself a Christian, but every attempt failed. Over time, he became convinced that faith simply wasn't for him. Eventually, he stopped trying altogether. If there was no hope beyond this life, he reasoned, then he might as well take everything he could from the world in front of him. He drifted into doubt, then into skepticism, surrounding himself with people who questioned everything he had been taught. And yet, even in that place of unbelief, one conviction remained. He often said, "If I ever truly believed the Bible, I would actually live by it. I would test it completely, and if it failed, I would walk away from it entirely." Then, one ordinary afternoon, everything changed. He was about 15 years old, alone at home, and bored. Looking for something to pass the time, he searched through his father's books, but found nothing interesting. Eventually, he came across a small pamphlet and picked it up, thinking to himself that it would at least contain a story he could enjoy. He sat down to read, completely unconcerned, with no expectation that anything meaningful would happen. In fact, he fully intended to stop reading as soon as it became dull. But as he read, a single phrase caught his attention: the finished work of Christ. He paused. Why finished? The question lingered in his mind, and almost instantly another phrase came to him: it is finished. And suddenly the meaning became clear. If Christ's work was finished, if the debt for sin had already been fully paid, then what was left for him to do? The answer came just as quickly. Nothing. There was nothing left to earn, nothing left to fix, nothing left to strive for. The work had already been done. All that remained was to accept it. In that moment, understanding flooded his heart. The weight he had carried for so long lifted, replaced by something entirely new. Alone, with no one guiding him, no preacher beside him, he simply bowed before God and accepted what had already been given. But at that exact same time, miles away, his mother felt something she couldn't ignore. An overwhelming urgency came over her, a deep, unshakable burden for her son. She left the room she was in, went upstairs, and locked herself inside her bedroom. And there she made a decision. She would not leave until she had prayed through, until she knew her son had been saved. For hours she remained there, pouring out her heart before God. Time passed, but she did not move. She continued until, at last, she reached a point where she could pray no more. And then something shifted. Instead of asking, she began to thank God, because deep in her spirit she became certain it had already happened. 2 weeks later, she returned home. Her son was the first to meet her at the door, eager and full of excitement. "I have something to tell you," he said. But before he could go any further, she wrapped her arms around him, held him close, and gently replied, I already know. He was stunned. No one had told her. No letter had been sent. There was no possible way she could have known. And yet, she explained how, on that very day, at that very hour, she had been alone in prayer, and how God had given her the assurance that her son had been changed. Some time later, another piece of the story came to light. He discovered that his sister had been praying as well, quietly, faithfully, every single day. In her journal, she had written that she would continue praying until her brother turned to God. Exactly 1 month later, her prayers were answered. From that point on, he never doubted again. Not the power of prayer, not the truth of God's word, not the reality of what had happened to him, because he came to understand something deeply personal. Before he ever chose God, there were people who had already been praying for him. And in time, that same boy, once skeptical, once wandering, would go on to become a missionary, helping bring the message of Christ to China. But his story didn't begin on a mission field. It began with a prayer, a quiet moment, and a single realization. It is finished. Come back next week to follow Hudson Taylor as his faith faces its greatest trial yet at the start of his missionary journey in China.